Expelling the Japanese from the Luzon Peninsula proved extremely difficult. After General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines on December 8th, just after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese swiftly took over U.S. Army Air Forces units stationed there. Their airstrike largely destroyed MacArthur's aerial capabilities. However, the remaining forces fought bravely and skillfully against overwhelming odds until the very end. Once Japan had gained air dominance, they landed on Bataan Island the same day, December 8th. More troops arrived in Apari and Vigan by December 10th. The underprepared Philippine Army encountered little opposition due to their lack of training and organization. Additional Japanese landings occurred in Legazpi from the Palau Islands on December 12th, followed by an assault on Mindanao on December 20th. Jolo Island was invaded on Christmas Eve. That same day, Japan launched its main landings on Luzon near Lingayen Gulf, between San Fernando and San Fabian, with over 43,000 troops storming the beaches. American and Philippine forces were rapidly pushed both north and south by the advancing enemy. MacArthur's initial beach defense plan for Luzon quickly became unfeasible. By December 12th, he advised President Manuel Quezon to prepare for the evacuation of Manila and to move the government to Bataan. As the Japanese continued advancing from all sides and air or naval support proved insufficient, MacArthur had to act. On December 23rd, orders were issued under War Plan Orange 3, which was a pre-war plan specifically created for the defense of the Philippines in case of a Japanese attack. The plan expected Japan to strike without declaring war and with minimal warning, making reinforcement nearly impossible in time. Therefore, American and Filipino troops stationed there had to hold their ground until reinforcements could be deployed. Luzon was always expected to be Japan's main target, given its vast plains, several military airfields, and Manila's ideal harbor. Under this plan, Filipino forces were to secure the entrance to Manila Bay and stop Japanese advances until U.S. reinforcements arrived. They were instructed to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula and move all supplies and equipment there. MacArthur initially resisted this plan, aiming to protect more of Luzon, but he eventually realized that only Bataan and nearby islands in Manila Bay, such as Corregidor, could be held. The rushed relocation left behind too many essential items. The defense of Bataan began on January 7, 1942, when Major General Jonathan Wainwright assumed command of the western sector and Major General George M. Parker, Jr. led the eastern defenses. Wainwright's corps, renamed the I Philippine Corps, worked under MacArthur's broader command. For 4 months, the Japanese pounded these forces with infantry, tanks, artillery, and airstrikes. Shortages in food and supplies took a toll, with soldiers becoming weaker and increasingly unable to fight. MacArthur, after ensuring all positions were held, reported to General George C. Marshall in Washington, stating he was prepared for a general attack. Over 12,000 patients crowded into poorly staffed hospitals, many of whom ended up in open areas due to lack of space. When MacArthur was ordered to Australia to oversee American operations in the Pacific, General Wainwright took over command from the fortified island of Corregidor in Manila Bay. Conditions in Bataan kept worsening. The Japanese finally broke through the last line of defense. Major General Edward P. King, Jr., realizing he had no combat-capable units left, chose to surrender despite orders not to. He believed it was the only way to save the lives of his men. Wainwright objected, having been directly instructed by MacArthur not to surrender, but King had no other option. On April 9, 1942, 78,000 troops of the Bataan Defense Force laid down their arms. The aftermath was brutal. The horrific experiences in Japanese prisoner of war camps, on hell ships, and during the Bataan Death March are infamous. After the surrender of American and Filipino forces, the Japanese paid little attention to Bataan. They had already secured Manila and its bay, which became vital supply hubs for operations farther south and east. To MacArthur, however, Bataan still mattered deeply. Upon reaching Australia, he made his iconic promise, "I shall return," and immediately began preparations for his comeback. That return would be long and bloody. The Japanese began withdrawing from numerous contested regions in 1942 and 1943, including the Solomon Islands, the Admiralty Islands, Hollandia, Biak, Sansapor, and others, as the Allies pushed up the New Guinea coast. Finally, on October 20, 1944, Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's 6th U.S. Army arrived in Leyte, marking MacArthur's long-awaited return. Even before this, MacArthur had been planning to retake Bataan and Luzon. After 3 months of intense combat, he adjusted his invasion strategy to suit the evolving conditions in the Pacific. Despite these changes, he always intended to land his main invasion force at Lingayen Gulf, where the Japanese had first come ashore in 1941. After landing the ex-Infantry Corps on Leyte, they were replaced by Lieutenant General Robert L. Eichelberger's 8th U.S. Army. The Lingayen Gulf offered direct access to MacArthur's primary targets, the Central Plains and the Manila Bay area. Additional landings were scheduled around the island, often at sites originally used by the Japanese, although not all would be carried out due to shifting battlefield realities. One unexpected factor was the intense defense of Manila. MacArthur assumed the Japanese would declare it an open city and withdraw, as they had, in 1941. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the top Japanese commander, initially planned to do just that. However, a senior Japanese Navy officer had other intentions, leading to a bloody and catastrophic battle for the city. Because all supplies and reinforcements had to move through recently seized bases like Nasugbu, where the 11th Airborne Division had landed, the 6th U.S. Army faced serious logistical problems. After the battle for Manila ended, the Seabees cleared Manila Bay's eastern shore, but they still had to secure Bataan on the western side. Major General Charles P. Hall's corps had landed northwest of Bataan, but had not yet advanced into the peninsula. General Kruger asked MacArthur what his intentions were for Bataan. At first, MacArthur assumed that Yamashita would retreat to Bataan and make a final stand, but that did not happen. He was ordered to delay American forces for as long as possible, hoping to tie them down and prevent them from being used to invade the Japanese home islands. General Yamashita saw Bataan as a strategic trap, where he could encircle his troops and allow American forces to focus elsewhere. Rather than defending the area with full force, he left behind units to delay the Americans and retreated into the rugged interior of Luzon, where he remained until the end of the war. General MacArthur had instructed his staff to capture Bataan quickly, unaware of General Yamashita's broader strategy. At that time, General Kruger's 6th Army was still busy with the battle for Manila and nearby areas. He ordered the 11th Corps to take Bataan. The Corps was commanded by Major General Charles Philip Hall, a West Point graduate from 1911 and a native of Sardis, Mississippi. After serving in World War I, where he earned the Distinguished Service Cross and several Silver Stars, Hall studied at the Command and General Staff School and the Army War College. At the start of World War II, he briefly commanded the 93rd Infantry Division before taking over the 11th Corps in 1942. General Hall's 11th Corps was composed of the 34th Infantry Regimental Combat Team from the battle-hardened 24th Infantry Division and the 38th Infantry Division. Initially, the plan was to land at Vigan, north of Lingayen Gulf, but it was scrapped after a strong Japanese air response from Formosa. Filipino guerrilla forces had already secured much of the region, lowering the threat of a Japanese flanking attack. As a result, 11th Corps was redirected to land on the Zambales coast northwest of Bataan. Their mission was to block any Japanese attempt to move troops out of Bataan, secure nearby airfields for Allied use, and attack the Kembu Group, a large Japanese force, by flanking from the rear. Intelligence estimated 13,000 Japanese troops were in and around Bataan, with 8,000 on the peninsula. In reality, only about 4,000 were stationed there, mostly understrength soldiers from the 10th Division's 39th Infantry Regiment. These troops, initially meant for Leyte, were rerouted to Bataan after the Americans seized the island. Colonel Sanu Nagayoshi led 2 battalions supported by temporary infantry companies, a light tank platoon, artillery, and smaller defense detachments. Although officially under the Kembu Group, these troops were informally called the Nagayoshi Detachment. The Americans cut off their escape route before Nagayoshi could withdraw, forcing him to prepare for defense. The 3rd Battalion of the 39th Infantry, with tanks and most of the artillery, was tasked with defending Route 7 at the base of the Bataan Peninsula. One regiment was stationed in Olongapo, another company guarded the San Marcelino airfield, and the remaining units were scattered across the coastal regions. Around 40,000 American troops attacked from the 11th Corps, including 5,500 Army Air Forces engineers, who aimed to restore San Marcelino airstrip. They had support from aircraft of the 5th Army Air Force and ships from the 7th U.S. Fleet. 11th Corps landed on January 29th without resistance, thanks to Filipino guerrillas confirming the absence of Japanese troops. As American forces arrived, Filipinos welcomed them, cheering and helping unload supplies. Major General Henry Lawrence Colum Jones, a Nebraska native and former cavalry officer, had commanded the 38th Infantry Division since 1942. The division, formed from Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia National Guards, was seeing combat for the first time, despite the 149th Infantry Regiment previously fighting off a Japanese airborne assault on Leyte. With local help, Jones ordered the 149th, led by Colonel Winfred G. Skelton, to advance inland and seize the airfield at San Marcelino. Filipino insurgents under Captain Ramon Magsaysay had already taken it. Nearby, the 34th Regimental Combat Team under Colonel William W. Jenna moved along Route 7 toward the north of Subic Bay, arriving before nightfall with support from a 24th Division reconnaissance troop. The Japanese did not resist the advance. The only incident that day was an American soldier from Company F, 151st Infantry, who was gored by a local carabao. Despite the calm, Japanese observers were aware of the landing. Second Lieutenant Hiroshi Abe, commanding an anti-tank platoon near Callan Point, spotted about 40 American ships and reported to his commander, Major Horori Owawa. The following day, a reinforced battalion of the 151st Infantry landed on Grande Island at the entrance to Subic Bay to secure the area. Lieutenant Colonel L. Robert Modern's men quickly took Fort Wint, a pre-war American coastal defense base, finding it abandoned. Poor beach conditions made offloading supplies difficult, but this proved to be the biggest challenge so far. The next objective was to cut off Japanese troops in Bataan and link up with 6th Army forces. Colonel Ralph C. Paddock's 151st Infantry Regiment remained in reserve. General Hall ordered the 38th Infantry Division to advance east along Route 7, using 2 regiments, supported by the 34th Infantry moving through Alapo, and the 152nd Infantry, under Colonel Robert L. Stilwell, advancing directly east. To reinforce the push, Colonel Jones sent 2 battalions from Colonel Skelton's 149th Infantry along a rough trail paralleling Route 7. Jones expected the Japanese to retreat instead of risking encirclement. Hall anticipated the route would be cleared by February 5th, though Jones did not provide a deadline. Meanwhile, intelligence from Filipino rebels under Lieutenant Colonel Giles Merrill, who warned that about 5,000 Japanese troops were heavily entrenched and armed, was largely ignored. The Americans estimated only 900 Japanese ahead. In reality, Colonel Nagayoshi had over 2,700 well-prepared troops positioned for defense. The advance was led by Lieutenant Colonel Edward M. Pohl, a West Point graduate from Kansas City, who commanded the 3rd Battalion, 34th Infantry. They encountered no resistance as they secured Subic Town. Following them were the division's reconnaissance unit and the 1st Battalion of the 34th Infantry under Lieutenant Colonel Charles E. Oglesby. The narrow, twisting road offered many ambush opportunities, which Japanese commanders were ready to exploit. Major Owawa ordered Lieutenant Abe's platoon to set up an ambush near Kalin Point, on rocky terrain by a lighthouse. Abe's unit had 2 anti-tank guns and 600 rounds of ammunition, along with machine gun squads led by Sergeant Tadashi Owaki and another machine gun from the 10th Company. Abe was backed by a team of engineers under the leadership of Sergeant Isam Miyake, who had prepared the road for demolition. The Japanese had built large trench systems and strong field fortifications to defend against the expected American invasion. They named their ambush area the Water's Edge position. However, their guns were dug in too far to be useful against Route 7 and were instead placed to block an anticipated American approach from Aleppo. After 1st Lieutenant Paul J. Cahn's Company Y of the 34th Infantry advanced, the 24th Division's reconnaissance troop moved forward with the support of 105mm howitzers from Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Long's 63rd Field Artillery Battalion. As they advanced, the Americans were mistakenly hit by friendly fire. Since no artillery observer had been assigned, Colonel Long's battalion was ordered to cease fire immediately. Not knowing whose artillery it was, Lieutenant C had his men dismount and sent 2nd Lieutenant John W. McFadden's 3rd Platoon to investigate. The Japanese opened fire the moment they noticed the Americans preparing to attack. 1st Lieutenant Richard V. Copy's 24th Division Reconnaissance Troop fired back with anti-tank guns mounted on jeeps and machine guns. Lieutenant C then ordered his platoon to clear a cemetery where Japanese machine guns were located. Meanwhile, Cahn called for backup, unsure of what they had stumbled into. Colonel Powell Waite sent out the Regimental Cannon Company, equipped with self-propelled 75mm guns, along with the 1st Platoon and the 63rd Tank Company. 2nd Lieutenant Kenneth Ian's platoon managed to bypass the machine guns and get close to a bridge with help from the Artillery Company. The Japanese engineers tried to stop them by creating a hole in the road, but the Americans surprised them by quickly building a bridge across it. Even tanks began moving across the steel plates laid by the engineers as if nothing had happened. The combat engineers from Company C of the 3rd Engineer Combat Battalion worked fast to cover the gap with steel matting. In this action, the Americans lost 3 troops and had 3 wounded. 14 Japanese soldiers were killed. This crossing point was meant for the 38th Infantry Division. The 34th Regimental Combat Team was supposed to lead the attack. On January 31st, the 152nd Infantry advanced on the road, while the 149th Infantry turned left onto a trail that ran alongside Route 7. General Hall expected the operation to be finished by February 5th. Despite Colonel Merrill's warnings about deeply entrenched Japanese forces in an area called Zigzag Pass, Route 7 climbed through this steep and rocky area. Colonel Moshi had placed his men in strong, interlocking positions stretching about 3 kilometers, possibly along an animal trail that wound through the jungle. The rainforest was so thick that visibility was limited to just a few steps from the road. The Japanese had built a network of trenches and tunnels with foxholes and pillboxes made of logs and mud for storing heavy weapons. Every position was well camouflaged. There was no shortage of ammunition for their mortars and machine guns. Nagayoshi spread out his artillery to avoid American counter-battery fire, making it harder for him to focus his own artillery. On the morning of January 31st, the 152nd Infantry moved past Aleppo and began climbing into the mountains via Route 7. At first, they faced only occasional rifle and machine gun fire, but as they neared Zigzag Pass the next day, enemy resistance grew much stronger. Another issue arose. Colonel Stilwell and his staff couldn't determine their location on the maps, which were already unreliable. The terrain made things worse. Radios frequently failed or had limited range. The code used by the 38th Infantry Division often scrambled messages, making communication difficult. The Corps and Division wrongly believed that the 152nd Infantry had already reached and passed the horseshoe curve by February 1st, though they had not. This inaccurate belief frustrated General Hall. That day, Lieutenant Colonel Del Albert D. Cornwell's 1st Battalion of the 152nd Infantry launched an early attack. Individual platoons and companies had to search for enemy positions hidden in the rugged terrain. Fire from concealed Japanese positions high above the road slowed their advance. As the 1st Battalion moved into the pass, the 3rd Battalion, led by Major Harold B. Mangold, was attacked from the rear. Again, the Americans had to fan out and locate the enemy. Not much progress was made during the day. After dark, night attacks began. Special squads under Major O.A., led by 2nd Lieutenant Shu Mao of the 9th Company, used mortars, heavy and light machine guns to cause chaos in the American rear. They attacked vehicles, supply depots, artillery positions, tents, and other structures. Using Molotov cocktails with handmade fuses and gasoline-filled bottles, they created fear and confusion. That night, Americans dug into the pass for the first time. Around 6 p.m., they heard enemy soldiers digging even deeper using shovels and mess kits. When the first shots rang out, Lieutenant Nano's unit from Company C suffered several casualties in the 2nd Battalion. 3 men were killed, 5 wounded, and 1 missing. Later research showed that a company from the 152nd Infantry may have reached the horseshoe curve on February 1st or 2nd, 1945. But they had to retreat because help couldn't reach them. The Japanese counterattacks killed soldiers across all 3 battalions. The 1st Battalion spent the day trying to locate Japanese defenses and find a way to get closer. The enemy's position was so intense that it was known as a hornet's nest. By the morning of February 2nd, the regiment had already lost 12 men, had 48 wounded, and 2 missing. And this was just the first day. They believed they could break through on February 2nd by clearing both sides of Route 7, but before that could happen, the 3rd Battalion came under fire from a previously unknown Japanese position to the north. They couldn't push through the defenses, and although they had broken through part of Colonel Moshi's central line, the Japanese had dug in along a line parallel to the road. This forced the 3rd Battalion to move southeast, while the 2nd Battalion met almost no resistance. The horseshoe defenses continued to hold back the 1st Battalion. Reports of the battalion's nighttime locations didn't match the ones at headquarters. General Jones believed all 3 battalions were near the horseshoe position, but in truth, only the 1st Battalion had reached it by February 2nd. That day, there were 5 more American deaths, 26 wounded, and 1 missing. They confirmed only 12 enemy kills by that point. However, they did manage to capture a Japanese map detailing Colonel Moshi's defenses. General Hall visited the regiment around noon on February 2nd and found the battle had barely begun. He was displeased with how the attack was going. One battalion commander admitted to having only 1 patrol looking for the enemy and didn't know where they were. Another couldn't explain why he had launched his attack so late. Hall told General Jones that he had never seen such poor performance from the 38th Infantry Division, even though he had only observed 1 regiment on its 2nd day of fighting. Even General Jones, who had personally led frontline patrols, was disappointed, especially with the 3rd Battalion. Colonel Stilwell was relieved of command and replaced by the regiment's executive officer, Colonel Jesse E. Kanosh. The 149th Infantry Regiment didn't fare much better. Even though they faced no direct resistance in the jungle, they reported being much farther ahead than they actually were. Aerial observers estimated they were at least 3 miles behind their reported position. Colonel Skelton noted that he could only hear artillery fire being used to support his unit because they were so far away. Radio communications broke down quickly, and General Jones lost contact with the regiment. uncertain whether replacing the commander would improve the 152nd Infantry's performance. General Hall decided to activate the 34th Infantry Regimental Combat Team to take over from the 38th Infantry Division. The new combat team would be under the 11th Corps in an unusual command setup. Colonel McIntosh's 152nd Infantry was now to follow behind the 34th Infantry Regiment, clearing any remaining resistance. When General Jones requested to use the division reserve, Colonel Modern's 2nd Battalion of the 151st Infantry, Hall was furious. He believed Jones already had more than enough troops to cross Zigzag Pass and insisted that only a small Japanese force remained. He left Jones acting more like a regimental commander. On February 3rd, Colonel Jennis's 34th Infantry Regiment moved past the 152nd Infantry while under mortar and artillery fire. Despite some success, the horseshoe curve remained under enemy control. The 152nd Infantry's battalions followed behind and destroyed several enemy strong points. By February 4th, the Americans had shown stronger performance, but the battle was far from over. They had to give up much of their gains by evening to take up defensive positions, resulting in very little ground being secured. General Hall urged for speed, but General Jones argued that he wasn't given enough time to upgrade artillery and clear the path for his troops, something the Japanese wouldn't have known. Sergeant Thomas Suai from the Japanese side visited a forward station and was stunned by how much the area had changed due to the destruction. He asked Private Nagar Kobayashi, a machine gunner, what had happened. The initial cannon fire from the Americans had been so powerful it stripped the hill of trees and vegetation. The 34th Infantry, despite being an experienced unit with a strong legacy, had suffered badly. Most of the original soldiers, including the previous regimental commander, were either missing, dead, wounded, or ill. About 78% of those who had landed on Leyte were no longer part of the unit. Though they had done better than the 152nd Infantry, they still hadn't achieved the breakthrough that General Hall wanted. Realizing the challenges of a divided command, Hall placed the 34th Infantry back under the 38th Division. The attack on February 3rd made it clear to Hall that his corps was facing a strong Japanese defense at Zigzag Pass. General Jones planned a calculated assault using battalions of the 152nd Infantry Regiment, while assigning the 34th Infantry Regiment to a key area known as the Horseshoe. Artillery support was limited east of the Santa Rita River, also known as the Jaded River, because of tough terrain and jungle conditions. This caused delays in artillery response. Colonel Jenna objected to placing his regiment between the battalions of the 152nd Infantry. He suggested his unit move south of Route 7 and that Colonel McIntosh's regiment take the north, but Jones denied the request, knowing his plan would already take longer than Hall wanted. Since Hall insisted on speed, Jones went ahead with the original plan. Although he really wanted to pull back both regiments, bombard Japanese positions for 2 days with artillery and air support, and then launch a fresh attack on February 5th. On that day, both regiments made progress. But when Japanese guns killed several civilians, another retreat was ordered. Colonel Jenna, who agreed with Jones's original plan, again suggested hitting the enemy with artillery for a couple of days before attacking again. Jones dismissed the idea under pressure from Hall's corps. In just 2 days of combat, Jenna's unit had taken heavier losses than in 78 days on Leyte, 325 battle deaths, and another 25 non-battle casualties. The regiment was no longer fit for combat, and Hall told Jones to replace it with the 151st Infantry Regiment. The 1st Battalion of the 152nd Infantry made good progress on February 5th, and captured a Japanese-held crest. In the afternoon, the Japanese pushed back harder, but the Americans held on and captured more territory by nightfall. However, just as they were setting up for the night, Japanese soldiers with rifles and machine guns emerged from hidden holes and opened fire. Confusion broke out as Americans and Japanese were too close together to safely use support fire. To avoid shooting their own men, the Americans had to retreat to the 3rd Battalion of the 34th Infantry. 9 Americans were killed and 33 wounded. All officers in Company C were lost, and only 1 officer remained in Company B. By the morning of February 6th, there had been no movement at Zigzag Pass for 4 days. Still, there was some good news. Colonel Skelton reported that the 149th Infantry had reached Ternate and made contact with the Civil Corps. Miscommunication had caused delays, but Skelton had continued with his original orders, unaware of Jones's repeated requests to pull back. In the end, this helped the mission succeed, as the Japanese could no longer reach the Bataan Peninsula. General Hall's frustration with the 38th Infantry Division peaked. He blamed General Jones for the problems. On February 6th, Hall visited the front and found that no offensive was underway. Troops were waiting for an artillery barrage and airstrike. When Hall asked what was going on, Jones said he expected the bombardment to last most of the day. Hall told him to stop the artillery and move the 152nd Infantry forward immediately. On his way back, Hall decided a leadership change was needed. He replaced Jones with Brigadier General Roy W. Easley as acting division commander, and the next day brought in Brigadier General William C. Chase of the 1st Cavalry Division to take permanent command. The change in leadership didn't immediately change the situation at Zigzag Pass. On February 7th and 8th, American troops still advanced slowly, held back by Japanese artillery and mortars. But unlike Jones, who had only 1 regiment under his command, Chase had all 3. The 149th Infantry attacked from the east behind Japanese lines, while the 152nd and 151st Infantry attacked head-on. Aircraft from San Marcelino Airfield bombed suspected Japanese positions. Artillery from division and corps level was used heavily. Despite the pressure, the Japanese resisted fiercely and held out another week. It wasn't until February 15th that the 149th and 152nd Infantry met from opposite sides of Zigzag Pass. By then, the Japanese had lost over 2,400 soldiers. Only 300 survived, including Colonel Nagayoshi, who pulled back into Bataan. There, his troops were weak and starving, exposed to attacks by Filipino rebels. The 34th Regimental Combat Team and the 38th Infantry Division had taken 1,400 casualties in the fight, including 250 killed. General Hall still needed to clear the Bataan Peninsula. He sent the 1st Infantry Regimental Combat Team of the 6th Infantry Division, led by Brigadier General William Spence, to the east side. The 151st Regimental Combat Team took the west. The Japanese defenders were scattered and quickly overwhelmed. Colonel Nagayoshi had fewer than 1,200 troops left, mostly stationed near Bagak on the west coast. Even though Corregidor's guns still covered the bay, American forces made steady gains, wiping out small Japanese groups. On February 15th, while General MacArthur's group was visiting General Spence's headquarters, they were nearly killed by a mistaken airstrike. Planes from the 5th Air Force had misidentified them as retreating Japanese troops and prepared to strafe the column. Luckily, disaster was avoided.